I'm Isaac Steincamp from the Chess Summit Network. For today's video, I wanted to show a game I played against a women's international master on the Internet Chess Club. While it was a G15 game and we both had a short period of time in the endgame, I thought that the endgame was fairly instructive because while it was a complicated position, by finding principled moves, I was able to win the game in a quite nice fashion. So here in this position, I have a Maroczy style position. I've got the flying V. This pawn on g3 and this king on g2 are obviously a little bit different, but the ideas are there. However, my opponent does have a pair of bishops, meaning that I have very little control over the d4 square, and my ideas are limited because my pieces are pinned down to this d4 square. So in this position, my opponent played h5 with the idea of playing h4. And I don't want to let my opponent open up the position too much, because if I open up the position too much, both of these bishops might become a serious problem for me. So in this position, I decided to block off the g7 bishop with e5. What this does is it gives me a little bit more flexibility because d4 is no longer under heavy stress, while at the same time allows me to plan for f4, blocking off this bishop permanently. Before I made this move, I had to consider moving all these pawns to dark squares would mean that while the g7 bishop is very limited, it does open up squares for this light squared bishop. However, from both f5 and g4, there really isn't too much activity that I'm worried about. So I played e5. My opponent played king h7 with the idea of bishop h6, but I just met this with f4 because now bishop h6 just shows how misplaced the bishop is. My opponent played h4 with the idea of undermining my pawn chain. And so here I had to find a critical positional move to make my position solid. Obviously, if I played g takes h4, queen takes h4 is a serious liability, and now this light squared bishop might cause trouble on h3. So I didn't want to do that. So after h4, I played knight to e4. By playing knight to e4, I have control over the d6 square, the f6 square, and potentially the g5 square. In fact, I'm threatening a fork right now that by making this check, knight g5, king g8, knight takes bishop, pawn takes bishop, I fix my opponent's pawn structure. And that's what happens in the game. So let me show you. H takes g3, knight g5, knight g8, knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, and knight takes pawn. Notice how this pawn is forever stuck here, and this pawn is going to have a hard time advancing. Meanwhile, this bishop has very limited activity on either one of these diagonals, and even if it goes to f8, it's not quite clear what it will be doing later in the game. So my opponent played bishop to h6 with the idea of pushing g5. So in these kinds of positions, it's critical to stop your opponent's idea, but also to make your position better at the same time. So here I played knight to e4, stopping g5, but also threatening knight f6 check, knight d6 blocking off the file, and maybe if the time is right, knight g5 if there's no trade on g5. So knight to e4, and my position's quite solid. My opponent played queen d1, which is probably the best move on the board. And before I show you what I played, I actually missed a tactic here. I missed queen h3, because now, if queen e2 check, knight f2, and if bishop takes pawn, queen takes pawn check, and now no matter where this king moves, it will always give up the bishop. So for example, king h7 loses to queen f7 check, king h8 loses to queen f6 check, and king f8 also loses to queen f6 check. So I only had a minute or so when I made my move, so I missed this calculation. But here I played king g3 with the idea of not allowing any checks from my opponent. Notice how any queen move, except for queen g4, which is a total blunder, there are no checks. I guess queen g1 too. But my opponent can't check me without losing material. So it really puts the pressure on my opponent to find something good. So after king g3, my opponent played bishop to f8. After all, this bishop wasn't doing too much from h6. However, with this critical tempo, it gives me time to make forcing moves. Because my knight's already optimized or put in the best possible location, I looked for forcing moves I can make with the knight. So in this position, in In this position, I played knight to g5, threatening the pawn, but I did want to show that knight f6, which is an interesting move because it's a check, doesn't yield too much because king f7, and it's not quite clear how my queen is going to attack my opponent's king. My opponent can also consider moving this bishop back to h6 and play around this knight from f6. So this is why I played knight to g5. By attacking this pawn, my opponent has to move her queen back to d7 because king f7 is obviously illegal. So my opponent plays queen to d7. So in this position, I just continue looking for forcing moves. Here I played queen to e4, attacking the g6 pawn. My opponent played king to g7. And so now, my opponent's pieces are quite tangled. So my idea here was, how do I manipulate my opponent's pieces to put them in weaker locations? What do I mean by this? This knight on g5 has served its purpose. The queen's already on d7. Now I want to put pressure on other squares in my opponent's position, so that way this queen has to leave the d-file. So how do I do this? I played knight to f3. My opponent plays b6, knight h4, threatening g6. So by moving my knight around, my opponent now needs two defenders on this g6 pawn. Because of the c6 weakness, my opponent has to play queen e8. Notice how this queen is tied to three different pawns. This queen is now stuck. This gives me the flexibility to play a move like queen d3. Notice how I'm still putting pressure here, so my opponent's queen is just as stuck. My opponent plays bishop e7, and now I start to maneuver my knight. Knight to f3, bishop to c5, knight to g5, queen e7, and knight e4. My opponent hasn't actually been able to improve her position because I still have the same target squares, f6 and d6. My opponent doesn't really have too much going for her. In this position, she plays bishop to b4. I played knight to f6. I'm threatening a queen trade on d7. And here I only have about 20 seconds left. My opponent plays bishop e1, and I play king g4. Bishop goes back to b4. And in the game I played queen d7. But when I was looking over the game afterwards, I thought queen h3 might be kind of interesting. And the reason for this is, I have the threat of playing queen h7, followed by king f8, queen g8, checkmate. And this queen has no real way of covering the h7 square naturally. So I looked at king f8, queen h8 check. You have king f7, queen g8 mate, right? Not too much promising action going on there. And I thought that this move, especially considering the amount of time left on the clock, the threat of queen h7 is extremely powerful. But queen d7 thematically is winning too. After queen takes, knight takes, and at this point we both had so little time that it was a time scramble, in which I won. But as you can see, this b6 pawn hangs. My opponent moved her king because she was trying to make moves as fast as possible, but here, even this move doesn't really yield any promising play, I think. I can just sit here. My opponent's pawns, or at least her weak ones, are all in light squares. So this bishop can never really focus on attacking them, protecting them rather, because, well, it's a different color, and these pawns are fixed. So I was extremely happy with this position. So if we go back to the original position in the game, so let's go back to when my opponent played h4. Okay, so here, when my opponent played h5 rather, it was a matter of, okay, my opponent has a lot of play, I only have a pair of knights, I need to close the position, so that way my opponent's pair of bishops is not so strong. So I blocked off her bishop, and even though she came off with this attack, I just used my knights to my advantage, made a good trade, and created a weakness. And by doing so, I reached a pretty favorable position. Now, while I did miss some opportunities because of the time control, I thought that this was fairly instructive because it showed how to use these outposts in these endgames. It's pretty much a good knight versus awkward bishop kind of scenario where, even though this is the same color as the bishop, because of the number of outposts that I have, it's just going to be impossible for this bishop to really be able to control this knight. And I was extremely happy with the kind of position that I got. So that was my game against the Women's International Master on Internet Chess Club. Until next time, this is Isaac Steincamp signing off. Goodbye.